I'd thought of a different way to handle the movement for the mirror character, so I decided it was a good time to remove all the references to it, add all the new game mechanics into the game, and then add the mirror character code back in. Before adding anything in, I wanted to fix a problem I was having with the character's movement speed. The movement in grid-based games is obviously quite different to that in other top-down games, since the player is limited to only 4 directions and moves exactly 1 unit per input. So I'll do a quick rundown of how the movement works in my game without going into collisions or interactions. Imagine this little p is the character. Like chess pieces, the character can only be in a cell or not be in a cell. So on this game board, they can be here, or here, or here, etc. Somewhere like this is an invalid location. Okay, so if I make them move by exactly 1 unit every input, that should work, right? Kind of. I'll swap the P out for the unanimated character sprite to make it a little easier to visualize. The character is technically moving correctly according to the game logic, but the sudden jumping from cell to cell is a little jarring. We'll add the P back in, which the game logic will view as the actual character. I called it move point in Unity. The character sprite follows it at some speed to hopefully smoothen the moving. Obviously the move point won't be visible during gameplay, but I'll show it here for clarity. With this, the sprite's movement is smooth, but the game still recognises the move point's moves as valid. If the sprite's movement speed is too high, they'll make jumpy movements like before, but if it's too low, we'll run into other problems. Since the move point is the character according to the game, and the sprite's the character according to the player, the sprite's movement speed affects the visual accuracy of the character's interactions. Say there's a button on the other side of the game board, and the player quickly runs over to press it. The button will activate long before the sprite reaches it. Obviously the movement speed will have to be dynamic, so they take single steps slowly, but speed up on longer runs. But even with a dynamic speed, there's this problem with corners. If the player moves quickly enough and turns, the character sprite cuts the corner and can clip through the entities around it. Here's the action replay. I needed some way to make the character remember the player's inputs. I made it so that every time it moves, the move point leaves behind a target for the character sprite to follow, instead of the move point itself. I've slowed the sprite's movement speed way down to show exactly what's happening, but you can see that no matter how fast the player inputs directions, the character sprite will always follow the path that the player took. Okay, so now I just need to make that happen in the code. This is how I had it at the time. Character movement, which is a component of the character object, has an array list which stores all the targets the sprite has to follow. Every time the character makes a move, a new 3D vector of the move point's position is added to the array list of targets. And on every frame, if there are any targets to follow and the character's position is a distance from the first target in the list, the characters move some distance towards that target. Then once the sprite reaches it, it's removed from the list and the sprite will start to follow the next target if there is one. It was working quite well in the game, but the movement speed seemed off. They're supposed to keep running up to the move point, but this lazy larrikin was slowing back down when approaching it. This is because in character movement, I'd set the movement speed according to the number of remaining targets left to follow. Which means that while the sprite speeds up as the move point moves away, when it approaches the move point again, the number of targets lessens and the move point speed is lowered again. You can see I'd planned to change this from the beginning. I fixed it by making a few changes to character movement. It now has an acceleration value which can be set in the editor. In every frame, Update instead calls a method setMoveSpeed. This sets a movement speed by checking if there's more than one target to follow and uses the acceleration value to speed up the character. The major difference here is that it can only accelerate. If the newly calculated speed is lower than the current speed, it's ignored and the character continues to run. You can see that I already wanted to change it again, but it's good enough for now. This is how it looked in the game. The acceleration is set quite low to properly show the effect, but you can see the character holds their speed once running, even when I stop inputting directions. I also previously couldn't hold a direction to keep the character moving, so I added that simple change and slightly updated the dust particle system. Alright, it's time to add some interactable entities into the game like I promised. This little silly Billy asked if the first one could be a key. I didn't have the heart to tell him there wasn't even a door, but I can't say no to that face. You're my prisoner, little buddy. Yes, you are. Anyway, the item component script has a boolean is held for if the item is being held or not, obviously. It also has a reference to the character object, so that in its update method, if the item is being held, it'll float ominously above the character's head. Character interaction, another component of the character object, stores the character's inventory. Inventory. Inventory? I'm conflicted. Anyway, the character's inventory is just an item object. Character interaction also has a method handle interaction, which is called every time the character moves. It uses Unity's overlap circle all method to find a collider in the cell they're moving into and checks if it's an item. If the character isn't already holding the same item, it updates the inventory accordingly and sets the item's isHeld boolean to true. This is how it looked in the game. Wait, is that the P from before? That's just confusing. Obviously its movement will have to be refined, but it's working well enough for now. Next I wanted to make the key item actually usable, so I made a door, but not to the outside world. Not to the outside world. The door component has a boolean isOpen, which can be altered using setOpen. At this point it just sets the door's colour to blue if opened and white if closed again. Character movement has a method called canMove, which determines if a grid cell can be moved into or not. If overlap circle finds a collider in the cell being stepped into, and if that collider belongs to a door, and if that door isn't open, but the character has a key in their inventory, canMove is not set to false and the character is moved. If character interaction's handle interaction method finds a door, and if the player is holding an item, and that item is a key, the door's isOpen boolean is set to true, and the key is removed from the character's inventory. This is how it looked in the game. That green square's a door, by the way. And since a blue door means an open door, the character can walk through it permanently. I wanted to have different ways to open doors, so next up was the button. The code for the button at this point was just as simple as the other entity components, but this time it has a reference to another game object, in this case the one it controls. It also has a boolean isPressed, which can be altered using setPressed. Since at this time only doors could be controlled by the button, the setter just opens or closes whichever door the button is connected to, and changes the button's colour to red or white if stepped on or off. In character interaction, the button being stepped onto simply has its isPressed boolean set to true. Stepping off the button was a whole other thing. I gave character interaction an array list of all the game objects on the cell that's being stepped off. When the character makes a move, all the game objects from the current cell are sent to the old entities list. Then after handling interactions, all the game objects are looped through to find a button, and if it finds one, it sets its isPressed boolean to false. I didn't like how and where this was being handled, but I was just being a little hacky to make sure everything was working first. This is how it looked in the game. That green circle's a button, by the way. Okay, so it's not deactivating the button when stepping off. This was just because I was making old entities a reference to current entities instead of making a copy, so when current entities was being cleared, so was old entities. After fixing that, it looked like this. The button deactivates like it's supposed to. Although I did come across this problem where if a door is opened by a key, it can then be shut again by stepping on and off a button, which feels odd. I had to decide if keys would permanently open doors, or if keys are connected to specific doors like buttons are, and that doors can only be opened by a key or a button. But that would have to come later when I start thinking of level ideas. Next was the portal, which also has a reference to another game object, in this case the other portal it's connected to. I'm not sure why I handled it here at the time, but the portal functionality was in character interaction. I moved it to the portal component script after this. Anyway, if the character steps into a portal, they just move to the position of the other portal. This is how it looked in the game. These limited edition Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 Supernova Doritos are portals, by the way. It seemed to be working pretty well, but this weird thing happens sometimes. I just needed to make the character clear its list of targets when it teleported, and that seemed to fix the problem. But since I'm not checking behind the other portal to see if it's even exitable, in case of export of processed animal protein and... what? But since I'm not checking behind the other portal to see if it can be exited, you can do things like this. Also, the item has no idea about the portal, so it just weirdly floats between the two. Ah, stay away from me. Alright, lastly I wanted to add a pushable component to certain entities. Like the character, a pushable object has a move point and a sprite separately for smooth movement, and a movement speed that can be set in the editor. When the object's pushed, its move point is moved to the cell it's being pushed into for the sprite to follow. Then every frame, just like the character, if the sprite is a distance away from its move point, it's moved towards it at the movement speed. I gave character interaction this hacky bit of code where it uses the character's can-move method to check behind the object to see if there's anything in the way, and if not, the Pushable Objects move pushable method is called. This is how it looked in the game. That eye is a pushable object. It's technically working, but you can see I'm purposely pausing between each move. That's because if I move quickly, this happens. Now the object's not even aligned to the grid. This is because character interaction was checking the position of the object that has the pushable component, which in this case for some reason was the sprite, so it was slightly off if I moved before the sprite had made its full move. Unfortunately, the way I'd handled its movement meant that the sprite object had the interaction code and the move point was the child of the sprite, but was disconnected from it at startup so they could be moved independently. This can be fixed by just moving all the code into the main object and making the sprite object a child of that. But anyway, I'd added a bunch of new things into the game and done minimal bug fixing for any of it, so now my Trello board looks like this. I had twice as many items in my bug fixes card than I did in my done card. But that's all for this update. In the next one I'll be trudging through the list of bug fixes and add a few more art assets. I'll still be adding a few more things before refining, so any suggestions for game mechanics that you think would go well with this game type are more than welcome. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and the development process so far. See ya folks. Have a good one.